Section 40 of Grey Mask by Patricia Wentworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 40. Archie felt a tug at his sleeve. Margot had jumped up, scattering her chocolates. She hung on his arm, laughing and excited. "Archie, you didn't guess, did you? Papa, I didn't tell him. I wanted to frightfully, but I didn't. So you see, I can keep a promise. I didn't tell him a single word, did I, Archie? Archie, isn't it frightfully exciting about Papa not being drowned? Papa, may I tell him all about it now? Because we're very nearly engaged, aren't we, Archie? Papa, he won't propose to me because he says I'm not old enough. Archie, if Papa says I'm old enough, will you do it properly? Papa." Mr. Standing put a hand on her shoulder. "I want to talk to Mr. Miller. Run away and play." Margot pouted, then brightened. "My hands are a bit sticky. If I go and wash them, will that be long enough?" Mr. Standing gave her a push towards the door. "I'll call you when I'm ready." When she had gone, he turned a cool, hard gaze upon Archie. "So you think Margot's too young to be engaged?" The back of Archie's neck burned. "I don't quite know when you came in, sir." "Well, I heard you tell her she was too young. I agree with you. We'll leave it at that. You didn't, I take it, expect to find me here." "I didn't expect to find Margot. I came here because Miss Silver told me to come." "Yes, I know all about that. I have met Miss Silver. She tells me I am very considerably indebted. Both to you and Mr. Charles Moray. I am very glad to have the opportunity of thanking you and of explaining some of the rather extraordinary things that have been happening. Sit down, Mr. Miller." Archie sat down. He was irresistibly reminded of interviews, now happily remote, with his headmaster. There was the same feeling of unpreparedness. Mr. Standing laughed suddenly. The atmosphere changed. "We're being a bit solemn, aren't we? That's my fault, I'm afraid. I must have been a bit of a shock to you. Now, Margot took me with perfect calm. She merely remarked, 'Oh, Papa, you're not drowned. How frightfully nice,' and at once proceeded to pour out a full account of some very curious adventures. Well, I'm beginning at the end of the story. I must go back a bit." Mr. Standing sat forward in his chair. "I want to begin by saying something about all this rubbish that has appeared in the papers on the subject of my daughter's legitimacy. I'm sending a statement to the press tomorrow. I married as a young man, and I am now a widower. My marriage did not take place in England. Margot is my legitimate daughter. I had not failed to provide for her future. I made my will 15 years ago. The document was in the hands of my solicitor, Mr. Hale Sr. It was destroyed after his father's death, and after my supposed death by Mr. James Hale. He was in it then. Do you know, sir, it was Margot who wouldn't let us go to him, and a jolly good thing we didn't. Charles Moray was telling me all about it last night. Yes, James Hale was in it, and so, I regret to say, was my nephew, Egbert. Well, that disposes of the will. About a year ago I became aware of the existence of a criminal conspiracy directed by a singularly cunning and able rascal. Certain things came to my knowledge, but I hadn't a shred of evidence against anybody. Then, about 2 months ago, my man Geoffrey came to me with a most extraordinary story. He was a good fellow whom I used as a sort of steward cum valet on my yacht. He'd been left stone deaf after shell shock. Well, a queer thing happened. He got his hearing back. He said it came quite suddenly one day when he was crossing Hammersmith Broadway. He said 1 minute everything was quiet, and the next the roar of the traffic nearly knocked him down. Well, he didn't tell anyone except me. He said he wasn't sure it would last, and then he had another reason. He went down to the yacht to get ready for my cruise, and he overheard a conversation between the under-steward and my butler Pullen. It was an appalling conversation. He came off and told me about it. Pullen and this man Ward were discussing the best way of murdering me. That's what it amounted to. Well, I thought things out, and I made up my mind to give them a helping hand. Do you see? Well, I don't exactly. I might have called in the police, and I suppose I could have got Pullen and Ward, but I wanted the others. Most particularly, I wanted the man who was running the show, Grey Mask. I thought I'd let them think their plan had succeeded and see if they didn't come out into the open a bit. So I told Jaffrey to see if he couldn't get taken on as second murderer. He did it very well, started by grumbling to Ward about his wages and one thing and another, got up some good red-hot communist stuff and let it off at discreet intervals. In the end, Ward told him the whole thing. But Ward only knew Pullen, and he didn't know him as Pullen or as my butler. He didn't know any of the others. Well, Jaffrey and I fixed up a very nice high-class assassination. We laid off Mallorca, and I hired a boat to hang around and pick me up after Jaffrey had pushed me overboard on a dark, windy night. I'm a first-class swimmer, and I had a lifebelt in case of accidents. It came off nicely enough. I went over to Paris and waited for news. Jaffrey went back to London, and then the fun began. They came out into the open just as I hoped they would. James Hale gave himself away by saying there was no will. He had handled it in my presence only a week before I sailed. My nephew Egbert also knew that there was a will. I had acquainted him with the terms of it no further back than last August. He and Hale trumped up a forged letter from me alluding to Margot being illegitimate. They staged the affair so that one of Hale's clerks, a perfectly innocent young fellow, found the letter. It would all have been very clever if I had really been dead. What I wanted to say to you is this. I never dreamt of any risk for Margot. It didn't occur to me that Hale would get her back from Switzerland. As soon as Jaffrey wrote and told me she was here alone, I came across. By the time I arrived, she had disappeared. It was Jaffrey who discovered her whereabouts. I decided that she was safe with Miss Langton. I was extremely anxious not to be recognized, as I had not yet got the evidence that I needed against Pullen and another man, the footman called William Cole. I was also extremely anxious to find out who was really running the show. On Tuesday, however, I made up my mind to fetch Margot away. I went with Jaffrey and the car to fetch her, but she took fright. I had told Jaffrey to tell her I was there. He said, Mr. Standing, and she jumped to the conclusion that it was her cousin Egbert who was trying to carry her off. Not unnaturally, she ran away. Yes, she told me. So that was it? Mr. Standing nodded. As you know, you upset my plans by taking her to a new address that day. It took me all day to find her. This morning Jaffrey and I followed her in the car, and I sent Jaffrey into Harridge's with a note for her. She came at once, and I brought her here. A conversation which I myself overheard last night between Pullen and William Cole convinced me that I could not risk waiting any longer. The two men were arrested this morning. James Hale, I am sorry to say, got out of the country. My nephew has thrown himself upon my mercy. I believe him to be a mere tool. The man I want, the man who's at the back of everything, the cold-blooded ruffian who gave orders to have my daughter removed, in other words, murdered, Miller. I'm no nearer knowing who he really is than I was when I began. He isn't Hale? No, he's not Hale, though I believe that Hale knows who he is. I don't believe any of the others do, and Hale's out of the country. The door opened and Margot came in with a doubtful air. You didn't call, but you've been simply ages. End of section 40. Section 41 of Grey Mask by Patricia Wentworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. Charles came back to feelings of extreme discomfort. He opened his eyes and saw light coming down from above. There was something dark on either side of him. The light came down between two dark walls. The right side of his head felt just as it had felt when he was 9 years old and had run into the corner of the dining room cupboard. He blinked at the light and tried to move. He couldn't. He had an instant of intense fear and then realized with relief that the reason he couldn't move was that his hands and feet were tied. At the same moment, a horrible choking feeling was explained by the presence of a gag. He was lying on his back with his knees drawn up. A thick wad of something filled his mouth. He stared up at the light and his head began to clear. The dark wall on the right was the study wall. The dark wall on the left was the back of Freddie Pelham's sofa. He was lying on the ground between the sofa and the wall, with his hands tied in front of him and his ankles strapped together. There was a most abominable gag in his mouth. These things, which belonged to the immediate moment, presented themselves with increasing definiteness. What on earth had happened? His unconsciousness hung like a black curtain between him and the events which had preceded it. He could hear Freddie Pelham moving in the room. He crossed the floor and threw back the lid of a box. Then he crossed the floor again. Now he moved a chair, and there was a rustling of papers. Charles knew that it was Freddie who was moving to and fro in the room. He could remember coming up the iron stair from the garden and seeing Freddie pull the blind aside and open the door to let him in. What on earth had happened after that? Something about Margaret. Something about Grey Mask. Quite suddenly, he had a swift, unnaturally brilliant picture of the study as it looked from the door. Not the door into the garden, but the other door that led out onto the staircase. He saw the room, and he saw Freddie Pelham with an automatic in his hand, and cool, cold murder in his eyes. He saw Freddie's finger move. That was the picture, everything in it very hard and bright and clear. It kept coming and going, and as it came and went, he began to remember. He had got as far as the door. He had turned. He had seen Freddie. He had ducked, and Freddie had fired. The shot must have grazed the right side of his head and knocked him out. Freddie had trussed him up and shoved him away behind the sofa. He had done this because Margaret was coming. At this point his mind became quite clear. He heard Freddie Pelham get up and come towards him. The sofa was moved some inches. Freddie leaned over the back of it and looked down at him. Freddie Pelham. Charles stared at a stranger with Freddie Pelham's features and Freddie Pelham's clothes. This was not the Freddie whom he or anyone else had known, the foolish, amiable Freddie whom one laughed at and was fond of, and who bored one so terribly with his reminiscences. Hard, merciless eyes looked coldly down at Charles. A cruel mouth relaxed into a smile. A clearer, harder voice than Freddie's spoke. "So, you're not dead. It's a pity. For you." Charles glared. At the sight of Freddie's smile, such a hot rage boiled up in him that he felt as if he would burst. Freddie nodded. "You're beginning to realize what a damn fool you've made of yourself. Amusing, isn't it? Just think of all the times you've laughed at me behind my back and been nice to me in a pleasant, condescending way for Margaret's sake. And just think what a howling fool you were making of yourself all the time. It's really rather a pity that I can't take the gag out and hear what you've got to say about it. Perhaps later on in a more secluded spot. I'm afraid it won't do here, but I should like to hear what you've got to say. I'm afraid you're not very comfortable, but that can't be helped." He held the back of the sofa and began to laugh, rocking gently to and fro. "My dear Charles, you've no idea what a fool you look. I'm really delighted that you're not seriously hurt. In case you're worrying about it, do let me beg you not to be fussed about your wound. It's really a mere nothing, a graze. You can't think how pleased I am, because there are things that I'm really going to enjoy saying to you. I've always disliked you a good deal. You had the impudence to admire Esther for one thing, and to combine it with a scarcely veiled contempt for myself. When I broke off your engagement to Margaret, I was really combining business with pleasure. I hope you realize how entirely you owe the pleasure of being publicly jilted on the eve of your wedding day to me. Charles had mastered the blind rage which betrayed itself. He kept his eyes on Freddie in a stare of contempt. Margaret told you that she saw part of a letter of mine. Naturally, I couldn't risk her marrying you and telling you what she had seen. As a matter of fact, I don't know how much she did see, but none of it was really fit for publication. I don't think I've ever been so careless before or since. I shouldn't have lasted so long if I had. I've had 20 years of it, and you're the very first person who has ever guessed that I was Grey Mask. The name fell like a spark into the vague gaseous imaginings that had been coming and going in Charles's mind. There was a flare which illumined all the dark places. By its light, Charles read his death warrant. The only person who had ever guessed the identity of Grey Mask would not be given the chance of passing the secret on. Something of this knowledge must have shone in his eyes, for Freddie laughed. "You've got it, have you? Think it over for a bit." He disappeared, crossed to the window, and almost immediately returned. "Margaret is coming up the garden. Now please realize this. If you make the slightest sound, if you attract her attention in any way, I shall shoot. Not you, but her. Don't imagine for a moment that this is bluff. If it comes in the way of business, I don't care who I remove. But as a matter of fact, I dislike Margaret almost as much as I dislike you, and if you provide me with the excuse, I shall be charmed. Make as much noise as you please. You can kick the leg of the sofa, I expect, if you try." He leant over and flicked Charles on the cheek. The next instant there came a tapping on the window. The sofa was pushed back into its place, and Freddie Pelham's footsteps receded. Charles lay quite still. Freddie meant what he said. He had not the slightest doubt of that, not the very slightest. He lay perfectly still and heard the French window open. Margaret's voice, Freddie's voice, the old half-hesitating voice. "Now this is very nice of you, my dear, very nice indeed. I meant to come round, but time's getting short, getting terribly short. First thing tomorrow morning, you know, and I don't feel as if I should ever be packed in time. I'm not good at it, you know, not at all good at it. Never was, never will be, what? Can I help?" The sound of Margaret's voice, tired, soft, kind, hurt Charles so much that he could hardly bear it. He could only see those two dark walls and the light coming down between them, but he knew in his heart how Margaret looked when she said that. She was pale, she had dark shadows under her eyes, she looked beautifully and kindly at the little mocking devil who would be charmed to have an excuse for removing her. Margaret spoke again. "Freddie, you look bothered, and I'm afraid I've come to bother you more, but I must." "Anything I can do, my dear." "Freddie, I'm in dreadful trouble about Greta." "About Greta? There, my dear, don't distress yourself. What's she been doing?" "Freddie, she's disappeared." "Oh, come, disappeared? You mean she's gone out with some young fellow and not come back yet? Give her time, what?" No, it's not that. She disappeared in broad daylight from Harridge's. The commissionaire saw her get into a strange car and go off. Archie's wild with anxiety." Freddie laughed, the old, rather foolish laugh, which was so familiar. "Master Archie's in love. He's jealous because Miss Greta has gone off for the day with someone else." "Freddie, it isn't that. Look here, Freddie. You may have guessed, I don't know whether you have or not, Greta is Margot Standing. Freddie's exclamation of astonishment sounded so natural that Charles started. No, not really. Freddie, Margaret's voice sank low and troubled. Freddie, Margot Standing, grey mask, did you know there was anything? Freddie said, hush, in a shocked breath. Did you, Freddie? Did you know that they wanted her removed? Freddie, I'm so dreadfully frightened. Margaret had sunk into the chair beside the writing table. She leaned across the corner of the table now and caught at Freddie's hand. You told me it was political. I believed you until the other day. My dear, Freddie, I believed you. She looked up at him through a mist of tears. Freddie, Charles was in his house the day you were ill and sent me to the meeting there. He heard things. He heard things about Margot. He heard them say she must be removed if her mother's marriage certificate were found. They talked about a street accident. He heard them. If he hadn't seen me, he would have called in the police then and there. I wish he had, for I'm desperately afraid about Margot. Now, my dear, Freddie was patting her hand. She pulled it away with a jerk. I think they've got hold of her. You'll help, won't you? Charles could hear how her voice shook. Freddie, she's only a child, really, just a pretty baby. You liked her. You can help if you will, because you know where to find him. The last word came with a gasp. Freddie Pelham had turned away. He put his hands over his eyes and did not speak. Freddie, you did like her. You'll help. What can I do? You can go to them. No, you must go to them or else. Her voice fell and steadied. I must go to the police. Charles heard a sudden sharp exclamation, protest, terror, then Margaret, very steady. If there's no other way, I must. Freddie spoke, terror rushing into panic. Don't be a fool. Charles likes her. Do you want him to like her? Aren't you fond of him yourself? Let her go. What does it matter to you? Do you want him to fall in love with her? Are you going to ruin yourself and me to give Charles an heiress? Is that what you're going to do? Don't. If it's ruin for me, you're in it too. Don't forget that. Charles knew the mockery of that shaking, craven voice. Yes, I know, but I can't let that child be hurt. A strange passion came into her voice. I ought to have done it before. I see that now, but I didn't know the risk she was running. I didn't, not till the other night. Freddie, that bus, it wasn't an accident. She was pushed. Freddie, who pushed her? With every word she spoke, Charles Moray's agony of apprehension was heightened. He was helpless, voiceless, dead already, and he had to see Margaret draw nearer, step by step, to the pit into which he himself had fallen. That she was lost from the moment she mentioned the police, he was persuaded, and to listen whilst Freddie played with her, used her to torture him, was the last indignity of pain. Who pushed her? He heard Margaret say that, and then silence fell, a long, cold silence. He did not see Freddie Pelham's hand drop down upon his knee. He did not see the mockery that looked out of Freddie Pelham's eyes. Margaret saw these things. Only a yard away from her there sat someone whom she had never known, someone whose eyes gave her an unbelievable answer to the question she had asked. The silence went on. Margaret's very heart was cold with it. She began slowly to believe that unbelievable answer. She began to believe the other things which the silence and those horrible eyes were telling her. She would have been very glad to faint, but her mind was clear and steady. It was her heart that was numb with pain. After a very long time, Charles heard her say, "Oh." The sound broke something, for immediately Freddie Pelham laughed. "So you've answered your very naive question for yourself. As your friend Archie would say, you've got it in one. I was aware that Miss Greta Wilson was Margot Standing, and when she so obligingly prattled at my dinner table about a certificate she had found, I thought myself justified in taking a slight personal risk when an exceptionally favourable opportunity presented itself. I reached behind you, and at the critical moment I pushed her. If you hadn't interfered, she would have been very neatly disposed of." Margaret sprang to her feet. "You're mad! You don't know what you're saying." "People are always mad when they run counter to the established order. I've been very successfully mad for 20 years. I have had very few failures and not one disaster. I am, in fact, a successful madman." His tone was coldly amused. "Who are you?" said Margaret. Even her voice shrank. Charles could guess at the horror in her eyes. He could guess at Freddie's smile. "Don't you know?" "No." It was just a breath. Freddie Pelham put his hand in his pocket and drew out a small automatic pistol. "I'm afraid you will have to pay the penalty for knowing that I am Grey Mask," he said. End of section 41. Section 42 of Grey Mask by Patricia Wentworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 42. The room was silent. Charles could hear nothing, see nothing. He strained and heard only the horrid beat of his own pulses. Margaret's hands had fallen on the back of the chair by which she stood. It was a heavy mahogany chair with an old-fashioned horsehair seat. Her hands closed on the smooth mahogany in the hard grip that felt nothing. The pillars of her house had fallen. She stood in the disaster and held blindly to the nearest thing that offered support. The shock was too great for crying out. It struck her dumb. She saw the pistol and the cruelty in Freddie's eyes. She hoped he would shoot quickly. It was too horrible. She hoped he would shoot quickly. He did not shoot. He balanced the pistol in his hand and laughed. "I'm glad you didn't scream. Marvellous self-control. If you had screamed, I should have had to shoot you at once, and that would have been a pity. I should like—" His voice slipped back into the hesitating voice that she had always known. "I should really like now to have a little talk with you first, my dear. A comfortable talk, what?" Margaret drew a long, deep, shuddering breath, and he laughed again. "Not any louder than that, please." It was Grey Mask speaking. "I don't want to have to put an end to our little party just as we're all beginning to enjoy ourselves. But I'm forgetting you're not aware that it is a party. They say 3 isn't company, but it does so depend on the 3, doesn't it? Now you and I and Charles." Margaret said, "Oh!" It was a quick, involuntary cry. Freddie Pelham took her by the shoulder. She had not known that there could be so much strength in his fingers. "You haven't said how do you do to Charles," he said. "Come along and have a look at him. He's been having a most entertaining time, and so have I. It's time you had a share in the fun. Let go of that chair." This last was a sharp command with a sort of snarling fury behind it that was quite sudden and very daunting. Then, in an instant, as Margaret's rigid fingers still held onto the mahogany rail, he struck her across the knuckles with the little pistol. The blow cut the skin. Charles heard her gasp and catch her breath. The next moment the sofa was pulled aside. Freddie was grinning at him, and Margaret looking with her bruised hands at her breast and sheer heartbreak in her eyes. She said, "Charles," and again, "Charles," very faintly, and "Is he?" and a long, long pause before her failing voice said, "Dead." "Not yet," said Freddie. Margaret cried out and wrenched away from him. "Steady now, steady. If you make a noise, I shall have to shoot him here and now. You can look, but you mustn't touch. He's a lovely sight, isn't he? You needn't be alarmed by the blood on the side of his head. It's a mere scratch, and won't interfere in the least with his enjoyment of the next few days. I'm not going to hurt either of you, you know, unless you positively oblige me to. I'm only going to leave you in a comfortable dry cellar, where you may or may not be found when the 99-year lease of this house has fallen in, let me see, is it 70 or 71 years' time from now? I'm really not quite sure." Margaret turned on him with a courage which stirred Charles Moray's pride. "Freddie, you're not well. What are you saying? Freddie, think." Freddie Pelham let his amused gaze touch first one and then the other of them. "My dear Margaret, it will save trouble if you will realize that you are not dealing with an amiable stepfather who has suddenly gone mad, but with a man of intelligence who has built up a most successful business and is prepared to remove anyone who endangers it. Though I dislike you both acutely, I should never have lifted a finger against either of you if you had not foolishly threatened me with the police. I never mix business and pleasure. It will save time if you realize this. As an illustration, I may tell you that the cellar of which I spoke just now was the reason for my buying this house, and for my continuing to stay here all these years. It has often been exceedingly useful. It was constructed by the eccentric Sir Joseph Tunney in 1795. I came across a reference in an old book of memoirs which caused me to buy this house when it came into the market. When I say that not even your mother has ever suspected the existence of this extra cellar, you will admit that Sir Joseph Tunney was a highly ingenious person. Why, Mark Dupre was there for a fortnight, with the police scouring the country for him, and not a soul ever suspected where he had been. He was wise enough to pay up, and when we had collected the money, he was found, as perhaps you remember, on the top of Hindhead in his pyjamas, without the slightest idea of how he got there. Margaret had been falling slowly back, step by step, with her hands out before her, as if to keep something away. As Freddie finished speaking, she sank down in the chair by the writing-table, flung out her arms across the scattered papers, and bowed her head upon them. "Well now, we'll go down and look at the cellar, what?" The reappearance of the old Freddie was the last touch of horror. Margaret cried out and lifted her head. "Freddie, there's one thing. Freddie, Mother, will you tell me the truth? What happened? Is she dead?" He stiffened. "That's a very extraordinary thing to say. What makes you ask a thing like that?" "An old friend. I met an old friend of hers. She said she'd seen her a fortnight ago in Vienna. I thought—" Her voice died as he looked at her. "Who is this friend?" "I shan't tell you. She only saw her for an instant. She didn't speak to her. Freddie, tell me." Her fingers clasped and unclasped themselves, tearing a piece of paper to shreds. "Freddie, tell me. Who is this friend?" She shook her head. "You don't know her. She doesn't know anything. She thinks it was a likeness. Please, please tell me." "What does it matter to you now? On the other hand, it doesn't really matter to me. So, as it happens, I don't mind telling you, Esther is alive, or was 3 days ago when her last letter to me was posted." Alive! The word came with a rush. I've already told you that it makes no difference to you. It's very irrational of you to feel any pleasure in a matter which won't concern you in the least. Margaret said, alive, again. This time the word was only a whisper. Freddie Pelham began to walk up and down the room. Yes, she's alive. If even the strongest of us hadn't got his weakness, she wouldn't be alive. She's been my danger always, always. He repeated the word with a certain fierce energy. A man in my line of business should never allow himself a serious affair with a woman. It's dangerous. You needn't think of me as a fool who gave way to a weakness. No, I always knew that she was my danger point, and I ran the risk deliberately because she was the only woman I have ever met who was worth it, and because I felt myself strong enough to surmount the danger. Margaret's eyes rested on him with a horrified surprise. Was this Freddie? He went on talking all the time in a low, hard tone. I risked it, and I risked it successfully until 6 months ago. Then she discovered something. If she had been an ordinary woman, I could have put her off. You know how quick she is. Besides, I was not altogether sorry. One gets a little tired of acting the poor fool whose only merit is his capacity for humble adoration. I welcomed the chance of showing myself to Esther as I really was. He paused, stood in the middle of the room looking down at the pistol in his hand. I ought to have ended it at once when I found how unreasonable she was. Instead, I went back to my acting. I played the penitent, and ye gods, how women do revel in forgiveness. She produced a plan she considered a stroke of genius. We would go abroad, making her health the excuse. I was to renounce my profession and any profits derived from it. A deliciously feminine piece of impracticability. Well, we went abroad. I allowed Esther to think that she was choosing our route. As a matter of fact, I had a plan of my own. I have for some years possessed a charming estate in Eastern Europe. I took Esther there by car. She had no idea of where she was when we got there. Fortune played into my hands. She fell ill after a scene in which I explained my plan to her. Then I must confess I displayed weakness. I did not accept what chance offered me. I found myself unable to do so. I found that I could not contemplate life without her. It was a weakness. I temporized. I sent telegrams announcing her death. At one moment I hoped that she would die. At the next I drove 300 miles to fetch a doctor. In the end she lived. I left her in trustworthy hands and came back. If I found that I could live without her, she could still be removed. If I was unable to conquer this foolish weakness of mine, she could remain in seclusion, and I could so arrange my affairs as to be able to go backwards and forwards. This morning— He stopped, looked down at the pistol with a cold, furious stare, and then went on quickly. This morning I heard from her, from Vienna. She had made her way there. How? I shall make it my business to find out. She could not have got away, except by treachery. It was impossible. She writes that she is well, that there are things she does not understand, that she is waiting on Vienna for a personal explanation. I propose to give her one that will remove all further danger from my path. Margaret turned her eyes from his face. Another moment and she would have screamed aloud. She caught at the arm of her chair and stood up. She was trembling very much. As Freddie came towards her, she went back, step by step, her hands behind her, until she reached the window and touched the edge of the blind. Freddie levelled his pistol. If you lift that blind or call out, I'll shoot. She shook her head, leaning there with half-closed eyes as if she were about to faint. Come away from that window at once, do you hear? 1. He wheeled suddenly and aimed at Charles. "Two!" Margaret ran forward, sobbing and catching her breath. "No, no, no!" He caught her roughly by the arm. "We've had enough of this. Come along. Walk in front of me to the door and open it. Remember, if you make one sound, it'll be your last." He turned and took an electric torch from a shelf. Charles saw the door opened. As Margaret passed through it, he thought with a frightful stab of pain that he had seen her face for the last time. She looked over her shoulder just before the door swung in and hid her from his sight. He strained with all his might against his bonds, only to realize that he was exhausting himself uselessly. He lay still and suffered for Margaret. The sudden break in her self-control, the pitiful sobbing, if only she had not broken down, if only her fine pride had held to the last. Charles Moray remembered that he had wished to see it broken. He remembered all the times she had looked pale and he had been angry, and all the times she had been sad and he had been cruel. And he remembered that he might have comforted her, and he had not, and now it was too late. He could not tell her now that he had loved her all the time. He could never tell her now. He had meant to tell her. He had meant to kiss the sorrow from her eyes and the sadness from her lips. He had meant to hold her close and hear her say, "Forgive, forgive the years I stole." It was too late. Halfway down the stairs, Margaret sank down. The hand on her shoulder closed in a bruising grip and jerked her to her feet. They passed out of the hall and through the door leading to the basement. Margaret's steps faltered. She had to lean against the wall. The hand on her shoulder forced her on down. In the basement, the empty kitchen and other offices, and at the back, a small flight of steps that led to the cellars, 3 in number, 1 for coal, 1 full of packing cases, and the third a locked wine cellar. Freddie Pelham unlocked the door. There was a good deal of wine in the bins, and at the far end a cask or 2 and some more packing cases. He shut and locked the door on the inside, and then proceeded to shift one of the casks and to move the packing cases. A low, stout wooden door barred with iron came into view behind them. It was barely 3 feet high and was secured by 3 strong bolts. Freddie shot them back. When I bought the house, all this was very cleverly hidden. Matchboarding and whitewash, very clever indeed. Without the information which I had extracted from an otherwise extraordinarily dry book of memoirs, I should never have found it. And you wouldn't be here. Let us praise the pious memory of Sir Joseph Tunney. He pushed the door, which opened inward. A horrible darkness showed beyond. He stood back with the mockery of a bow. "It's perfectly dry and on the warm side. Your last hours should be quite comfortable." Margaret leaned against the packing cases. "And if I won't, I shoot you here and push you into that most convenient vault. In with you." "Freddie!" The word died on her lips. There was nothing to appeal to. There wasn't any Freddie. There was only Grey Mask. She had to bend almost double to pass that horrible low door. Freddie's torch threw a dancing ray beyond her into the darkness. Her head swam as she watched it flicker. The rough floor seemed to tilt and tremble. Her foot slipped and she fell forward. Behind her, the door slammed, and she heard the bolts go home. The flickering ray was gone. It was dark. End of section 42. Section 43 of Grey Mask by Patricia Wentworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43. Margaret lay where she had fallen. The strength had gone out of her. She lay quite still and strained for any sound from beyond the bolted door. There wasn't any sound. She could not hear Freddie's retreating footsteps or the opening and closing of the wine cellar door. She could not hear anything at all. The place was soundless, lightless, utterly cut off. The warm, heavy air weighed on her with a deadening pressure. She kept her eyes shut so that she could not see how dark it was. Minutes passed. It was a very little thing that roused her. Her left hand lay on a sharp point in the uneven floor, and a good part of her weight rested on this hand. The pressure became unbearable. She moved, shuddered, and sat up. Instantly she wished that she had not moved, that she had let the sharp point prick her to the bone. The darkness of the place was dreadful. In every direction there was a gloom so dense that it seemed to forbid movement and breath as well as sight. Only thought remained. Charles. Was she to die alone in the dark? What had happened to Charles? Would she ever know? What was happening? The door and the darkness were between her and the answer to all the terrified throng of thoughts that clamoured to know. She covered her face with her hands and bent her head upon her knees. She mustn't let herself lose grip. Grey Mask couldn't touch them, really. Nothing could touch you as long as you held on. Not darkness nor silence, nor anything that anyone could do. She stopped minding the dark. It seemed to be a very long time before a sound reached her. It came suddenly, harshly, as the bolts ran back and the door swung in. She sat up, her heart beating violently, and saw the beam from Freddie's torch cutting across the corner of the nearest packing case. The wood was rough and splintered. The beam gave each splinter its own black shadow, then shifting, touched Charles Moray's foot. His ankles had been untied. He seemed to be leaning against the case. Behind him, Freddie spoke. "Pride goes before a fall. Get down and get in. I haven't any more time to spare for either of you. Get inside." Margaret was filled with a curious, trembling joy. Charles was here. Whatever happened, they were going to be together. She drew back and saw him come through the low doorway, bent double. Suddenly he pitched forward as Freddie thrust at him from behind. Margaret gave a sharp cry of pain and had the light flashed full upon her face. "Well, well," said Freddie Pelham, "you can now make the most of your time together. You can break your fingernails trying to undo my knots, and when you've got them undone, you'll be just as far from getting out of this as you were before. It may save you a good deal of trouble if I tell you that this place is absolutely soundproof. You won't even hear me lock the wine cellar door as I go out, and from the other side of that door I shouldn't hear a sound if you were shouting through a megaphone. There are 8 feet of earth between you and the garden, and 6 men couldn't break down the door. I don't know what old Joe Tunney used this cellar for, but I know what we've used it for, and it has stood the test every time. The ventilation is quite adequate and rather ingenious." He shifted the torch and allowed it to light up his wristwatch for an instant. "I must be going. I have still a few things to do, and I have to be up early. Perhaps it may solace you tomorrow to think of my flying to Vienna. With any luck we shall get above the fog. You can think of me bathed in sunshine. There was an old-fashioned song which I remember an aunt of mine used to sing, very charmingly. For I am content to abide in the shadow, so long as the sunshine falls brightly on thee. In Vienna I have an account to square." His voice had changed. The words came slowly. There were strange undertones of reluctance, effort, fear. Grey Mask's one weakness was a weakness still. It was not the least of Esther Brandon's many triumphs. With a quick jerk, Freddie Pelham slammed the door on them. The bolts were shot with violence. Margaret listened as she had done before and heard no further sound. She put out her hand and groped for Charles, and then a dreadful thought struck her rigid. Suppose Freddie hadn't really gone. Suppose he were just waiting there on the other side of the door to see what they would do, listening, waiting, ready to break in on them and snatch away their little lingering hope. She crept to the door, laid her ear against the crack, and listened with such an intensity that it seemed to her as if she must hear every sound in the world. She could hear nothing. Then in the dark beside her, Charles Moray moved, struggling into a sitting position. Instantly she forgot Freddie. Still on her knees she turned, her arm flung out, struck against his shoulder, and came about him in a movement astonishingly full of protecting strength. She began to whisper to him. "Charles, are you all right? I'll get this dreadful thing out of your mouth. If I were only sure he'd gone. Do you think it's safe? Wait just a minute, whilst I listen again. Are you all right? Move your head if you are." She felt it move and turned back to the door. Not a sound, not one smallest sound. After all, why should he wait? He wouldn't wait. He would want to get away. She turned round again. "I think it's all right. He'd want to get away. I want you to lean against me. Yes, like that, so that I can feel just where you are. I came straight from the shop, so I've got my scissors. I've been thinking of them all the time. I can cut that horrible bandage, only you must keep awfully still." The fingers of her right hand went to her coat, unbuttoning it. The scissors hung at her side, a good strong pair, really made for use. She cut through the ribbon that held them, and then, shielding the point with a very careful finger, guided them to where the bandage crossed his left ear. The gag had been tied on with a silk handkerchief. Once the point was under the tight fold, it was easily cut. Charles had never experienced a more blessed relief. He coughed, spluttered, and spat out the gag. Another handkerchief by the feel of it. Margaret was fingering the rope at his wrists. This was silk too, one of those heavy cords that are used to loop back the old-fashioned type of curtain. The knots might have defied her, but the strands were soon cut through. "That's great!" He stretched his arms, then felt his head gingerly. "Are you all right? Charles?" "Right as rain." "Shh! Perhaps he's still there. He mustn't hear you speak. Do you think he's gone?" "My dear, what does it matter?" Why did you say that?" Charles put his arms round her. "We'd better face it, old girl. We're through. If he came back and shot us, it would be quicker." She did not speak for a minute. She did not speak because for a long minute she was too happy to speak. She leaned against Charles in the darkness and felt his arm about her, very strong, very steady. Nothing seemed to matter. The arm about her tightened. "Margaret." She turned her face to him. "Margaret, we're together." "Yes." The word was a sighing breath. "I've been an utter beast to you. I loved you all the time." He felt her draw away. "I thought you loved Greta." "Good Lord, I'm not a nursemaid. The creature's about 5 years old. You didn't really think so." "I did. My darling idiot." He kissed her. "Do you think so now? Now? Why are you crying, Meg?" Margaret hid her face against him. "Because I'm so happy." There was a blessed silence. The cellar, the darkness, the desperate, hopeless state in which they stood were just the outer shadow which could not touch them. Margaret, at least, was in some joyful place of heart's desire, the haven which she had longed for and never hoped to see. To Charles, the shadow was a visible menace. He spoke first. "They'll look for us. They're bound to look for us." But even at the sound of his own words his heart sank. They might look, But how would they ever find them here? If we'd a light, do you know how big this place is? No, I don't think there's any way out, or he wouldn't have left us. But, Charles, they will look for us. Did anyone know you were coming here? One of the girls at the shop did. I told her I was going to say goodbye to my stepfather. And Archie knew. She stopped, trying to remember exactly what she had said to Archie. What? I'm trying to think. I said, yes, I'm sure I only said, I didn't mention Freddie's name. I told Archie to go to the police, and he didn't want to. Did he know about me? I told him last night. It seems about 100 years ago. What did you say to him? I said there was someone who might know where Greta was. Oh, Charles, I wonder where she is. Is that all you said? I think so. But if he was to ask at the shop, they might think, this place is so damnably well hidden. Charles, I want to tell you. Does it make it worse for you to hope? I do think there's some hope. Where? To Charles there seemed to be no hope at all, because I'll tell you. You know, when I was sitting at the table up there in the study, I was desperate. I felt I must do something after he said that about the cellars. I don't know if you could see me. I had my arms on the table and I put my head down and pretended I was crying. I wasn't crying. I'd seen a pencil and I got it in my fingers and wrote on a bit of paper. I wrote cellars, C and M. I kept the paper in the palm of my hand. I thought what I would do. It was just a chance, but it was the only thing I could think of. All the time he was talking and walking up and down, I was trying to think, and I tore up some little bits of paper quite small and kept them in my other hand. When I went back to the window, as if I was frightened, oh, I was frightened. I didn't have to pretend. I was horribly frightened, because I thought he'd shoot you if he found out. What did you do? Said Charles quickly. I stuck the paper on the glass on the window pane. I'd sucked my finger and made it wet, and stuck the paper on the glass, the bit I'd written on. I wasn't sure if it would stick, but it did. It's only a chance, but if he doesn't find it, they will. Charles held her tight. Is it behind the blind? Yes. He won't pull up the blind. Why should he? I don't believe he'll find it. Archie's bound to come here. Margaret, darling, 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 I believe you've saved us. I couldn't think of anything else, except I dropped a little bit of paper on the stairs, and here and there on the way down to the basement, and one at the wine cellar door, and 2 or 3 where the packing cases are hiding this little door. I had to chance his seeing them, but he only had a torch. I thought I was bound to risk it. Do you really think they'll find us? A cold revulsion sobered Charles. The hope which had carried him away offered so much. It gave him happiness, love, and Margaret. He was afraid to look at what it offered him. I don't know, he said. End of section 43. Section 44 of Grey Mask by Patricia Wentworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 44. Long hours of the night. Very long, very dark. Charles explored the cellar and found it about 12 feet square. There was no sign of any other opening. He lifted Margaret as high as he could hold her. She could just touch the roof. Later he broke her scissors in a vain attempt to dig through the wall into the wine cellar. The points slid and broke on very hard cement. The door itself would have withstood a battering ram. There was nothing for it but to wait. They talked. There was so much to talk about. And then, quite suddenly, Margaret fell asleep with his arm about her and her head against his shoulder. The air was heavy and rather warm. It had the curious smell of underground places where no light ever comes. Presently, Charles slept too. He awoke with a consuming thirst, and as he moved, Margaret stirred and woke too. Her little cry of surprise cut him to the heart. She had forgotten. Now she must remember and face a black day of dwindling hope. In those night hours Charles had come to think their chance of being discovered a very slender one indeed. Margaret said, "I'd forgotten. I was dreaming." A little shuddering laughter shook her. It felt so real, a great deal more real than this. "I suppose, Charles, I suppose this isn't the dream." If it were, if they could wake up and be together in the light. Charles put his face against hers. "What did you dream, Meg?" "I don't know. It's gone. It was something happy. You were there. We were frightfully happy." If they could wake up. He held her hard for a minute. Then his clasp relaxed, and he said with a sudden violence, "That little devil must be starting. Is it morning?" "Yes, 7 o'clock. Quite light outside." A most terrible longing for the light swept over Margaret. She had a picture of the grey morning and an airplane rising higher and higher until the sunlight struck the wings and made them shine. She cried out, "I can't bear it. Charles, if they don't come today, if they don't come soon, he'll get there, he'll get to Vienna, and she doesn't know. She'll be waiting for him, and she doesn't know. We're all in the same boat, my dear. I can't bear it." There were tears in her voice. "It's so awful not to be able to do anything. When I think that she's alive, I want to sing for joy. And when I think of him getting nearer and nearer, and no one to warn her, Charles." She clung to him in a passion of bitter weeping. "She's got more chance than we have, darling." The blunt fact came out bluntly. "In a sort of a way he cares for her, and they may find us, you know." Margaret's passion sank strangely into calm. "You don't think they will?" Charles Moray was silent. End of section 44. Section 45 of Grey Mask by Patricia Wentworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. Miss Silver, thank heaven. Miss Maud Silver looked mildly at an agitated young man. She took a latchkey from a neat, capacious bag and opened her office door. "Come in, Mr. Miller." Archie came in, flung his hat on a chair, and rumpled his hair violently. "I've been walking up and down waiting for you till I thought I should go mad." "Dear me, Mr. Miller, and why?" "Where's Charles Moray?" Miss Silver paused in the act of taking off a long drab raincoat. "I really have no idea. Where's Margaret Langton?" "Mr. Miller, what do you mean?" "I mean they've disappeared. That's what I mean. I've been trying to get on to Charles since 2 o'clock yesterday. He's never been back to his hotel. I went to Miss Langton's flat last night, and she wasn't there, and she hasn't been to work. What's happened?" A faint, fleeting smile just touched Miss Silver's face. "They might have gone away together." "Don't you believe it. Something has happened. Now look here. Charles went down to his house yesterday afternoon and stayed there till it was dusk, sorting papers. I've seen the housekeeper. He let himself out by the garden way, and nobody's seen him since." "And Miss Langton?" "I've just been seeing her. When I rang you up yesterday, I was all worked up about Miss Standing. Miss Langton told me to go to the police. I didn't want to do that." Archie hesitated. He wasn't sure how much Miss Silver knew. There were reasons for not bringing the police into it. Miss Silver gave her little cough. "I'm aware of that. It was, if I may say so, exceedingly courageous of Miss Langton to suggest your going to the police. But," she coughed again, "have you considered the probability that she has disappeared as a consequence of that suggestion?" Archie nodded. "I thought about it." Mr. Moray may have taken her away. I don't think so, because you see, I said I wouldn't go to the police. You said you wouldn't go to the police? Not till we tried everything else, and Margaret said there was someone who might know where Miss Standing was. She said she'd go and see this person as soon as ever she got off, and she promised to ring me up at my cousin's. Well, she never rang me up at my cousin's, and she never went back to her flat, and it seems to me she might have seen this fellow, whoever he was, and he might have cut up rough. On the other hand, he might have known that Miss Standing was safe, and Miss Langton may, as I suggested before, have thought it wiser to disappear. There have been several arrests. She'd have rung me up, said Archie doggedly. She said she'd ring me up, and she'd have done it. Don't you believe she's disappeared of her own free will. She hasn't. I'm very worried about her, and I'm going on worrying other people till I find her. Miss Silver took the brown exercise book, turned to a blank page, and wrote. In a moment she looked up. Yes, I went to Saunterell's this morning. That's Miss Langton's hat shop. I asked to speak to the other girls, bit of a VC job that, and one of them says Margaret told her she was going off to say goodbye to her stepfather. Look here, Miss Silver, it's damned ridiculous, but I can't get it out of my head. Margaret's stepfather is Freddie Pelham. He lives in a house in George Street. The gardens run down to the gardens of Thornhill Square, with just an alleyway between them. Margaret went to say goodbye to Freddie Pelham at 6 o'clock. Charles came out of his house in Thornhill Square at somewhere about 5. He came out by the garden way. That's to say, he was within 50 yards or so of Freddie Pelham's back gate. Supposing he went up to say goodbye to Freddie Pelham too. Margaret went, and she hasn't come back. Charles hasn't come back either. It's damned ridiculous, but I can't get it out of my head that old Charles may have gone there too. There are other explanations, said Miss Silver. Then she coughed and asked abruptly, Where is Mr. Pelham? Gone abroad. I told you Margaret was saying goodbye to him. Left this morning by aeroplane. Address Poste Restante, Paris, and a fat lot of good that is. Miss Silver tapped with her pencil. Are you suggesting that we should apply for a search warrant? No, I'm not. I'm suggesting doing a little bit of breaking and entering. Look here, Miss Silver, are you game? I'm suggesting you and me going boldly in by the garden door and opening a window with a skeleton key or chisel or what not. Unless Freddie's done something drastic since I used to play in and out of the garden with Charles and Margaret, there'll be some odd window I can get through. The question is, are you game? I've my reputation to consider, said Miss Silver. She coughed. If I were walking along George Street and were to ring Mr. Pelham's bell... She paused and gazed at him mildly. If you open the door to me, it really would not be any business of mine how you got in. Right, I do the breaking and you do the entering. Come along. 3/4 of an hour later, Mr. Miller crawled through a scullery window. It was a tight fit, and there was broken glass about. His clothes sustained some damage. He dusted himself, wondered why a scullery always smelt of cabbage, and proceeded upstairs, where he reconnoitred George Street through a hole in the drawing-room shutters. Miss Silver, in her drab raincoat and old-fashioned turban toque, was walking slowly along the opposite pavement. She held a newspaper in her hand. Archie proceeded to the front door and oscillated the brass flap of the letterbox. Miss Silver crossed the road and rang the bell. The door was secured by bolts at top and bottom. They creaked a good deal. Archie opened the door with a flourish, and Miss Silver came in. As soon as the door was shut, she turned to Archie as if she were about to speak, then suddenly changed her mind. Instead, she folded the newspaper and put it into her bag. They went together into the drawing-room. The closed shutters made a gloom there. Miss Silver took a torch from the pocket of her raincoat. After 10 minutes they went to the dining-room and then up the stairs. About halfway to the study, Miss Silver stooped and picked up a little piece of torn paper. It was just such a piece as might be torn from the corner of a letter. She flashed the light to and fro, but found nothing more. The study was not so dark as the drawing-room. There were no shutters here, and the maroon curtains had not been drawn. A light blind, reaching to within an inch of the floor, screened the long French window. Archie went over to the window and released the blind. As it left his hand, Miss Silver called to him. "Mr. Miller, come here." He came quickly. He had not thought that placid voice could be shaken. Most undeniably, it shook now. "Mr. Miller, look." She pointed, and Archie looked. At about the level of his shoulder, the woodwork at the side of the door was cracked. The edge of the jamb showed a small, semicircular furrow, the wall behind a neat, round hole. Archie gave a faint whistle of dismay. "A bullet hole, by gum!" "I think so. I think the bullet's in the wall. I trust he missed whatever he was aiming at." She walked over to the table, stooping on her way to pick up another torn scrap of paper. This one lay near the chair, which was drawn close up to the side of the table. She stood for a moment, small grey eyes intent, hands clasped on the old-fashioned reticule she always carried. Then she leaned over the table. 6 little bits of paper lay amongst Freddie Pelham's letters, just as they had slipped from Margaret's hand. Miss Silver nodded, straightened up, and looked about her. The table stood a couple of yards from the window. She looked across it and saw the garden sloping to the alleyway. The trees had a mournful, drooping look, half their leaves gone, and those that were left to them, poor, torn, draggled survivors. She saw the ugly spirals of the iron balustrade guarding the garden stairs. She saw the long window between heavy maroon curtains, one looped back, the other hanging straight, and she saw a piece of white paper lying at the foot of the straight curtain. She went over, picked it up, and held it out at Archie. "Well, Mr. Miller, you were right. They're here." Margaret had stuck her piece of paper on the glass, but as it dried it had fallen. Archie read the scrawled pencil message, "Sellers, C and M." He read it, turned to stare at the hole Freddie Pelham's bullet had made, and once more whistled softly. "What's it mean? We shall doubtless find out. Perhaps you know the way to the cellars. I think we had better go there at once." She was through the door before she finished speaking. Archie followed. At the door leading to the basement, Miss Silver found another piece of paper. She coughed approvingly. "It's a pleasure to work with anyone so intelligent." "I say, that's awfully nice of you." "I was not referring to you, Mr. Miller. Miss Langton must be a highly intelligent person, even for a woman." They went down into the basement and farther down to where 3 cellar doors opened upon a dark flagged passage. "These 2 always were open," said Archie. "Freddie liked messing about and doing a bit of carpentering in this one, and the other's for coal. The 3rd's the wine cellar." He tried the door. "It's locked all right." He rattled the latch and shouted, "Hello! Hello, hello! Charles, are you there? Is anyone there?" A booming echo came rolling back along the low roof. It said "there" and "Charles" and died. Something fell with a clang. Miss Silver turned her torch down, picked up a metal bar and put it into Archie's hand. "What is it?" "Well," said Miss Silver, she gave a slight cough, "I believe it is called a jemmy, an instrument in use amongst burglars. I, of course, have my reputation to consider, but if you—" She coughed again. "It really seems quite providential, doesn't it?" "Heaven helps those who helps themselves, in fact," responded Archie. Miss Silver proceeded to give him expert advice as to lock-breaking. The silence of the inner cell had not been stirred. It settled heavily and more heavily still. It was half an hour since Charles had spoken, and Margaret answered him. Their torment of thirst had begun. It was long past midday, and hope waned as the light wanes after sunset. Their sun had set. The little light of hope that had remained failed and was forgotten. They were forgotten in a dark, hidden place, out of mind. The first sound was faint. It jarred that settling silence, but so faintly that it might have been some ghostly mirage of sound, causeless and unreal. Margaret stirred, moved her hand to meet Charles Moray's hand, and turned her head to say on a whispering breath, "Charles." His hand pressed hers. "Did you hear it?" "Yes." "Charles, what was it?" The silence settled again. That faint sound had reached them when the wine-cellar door gave way with a crash and set all the underground echoes calling. Miss Silver flashed her torch round the well-stocked bins, up to the low roof, down again to the flagged floor. At the far end, a cask or two, packing cases, a shred of white torn paper. She picked it up. "They've been here, Mr. Miller. I think we'll move those casks." On the other side of the casks and of that thick, deadening wall, Margaret was listening as she had not listened since Freddie Pelham had left her in the dark. Alone. She could hear nothing. But she had heard something. Suppose they came and went away again. The thought pierced to the quick. She tried to call out, but the terror of the thought took away her voice. It failed in a dry throat. She tried to tell Charles to shout. Her hand clung to his, and suddenly the door swung in. The silence broke into harsh sound. The bolts went loudly back, and the door swung in. The noise was overwhelming. Archie's shout shook the cellar, and a dancing, flashing ray struck her eyes like a blow. Darkness closed over her. When she opened her eyes again, someone was giving her water to drink, and it was light. She looked at the light and wondered at it. Grey London light. But how beautiful! She drank again. Water, how lovely! Light, air, water. She drew a long, long breath and came back from the halfway place between dream and waking. She was lying on the sofa in the study. A little woman in a drab raincoat was holding water to her lips in a cracked breakfast cup. Margaret took another lovely sip and sat up. She saw Charles, dusty, blood-stained, unshaven, his face smeared and dirtier than anything she could have imagined. He put down the cup from which he had been drinking and came to her and kissed her. It didn't matter how dirty his face was, how lovely to be alive, to be together. The most exquisite happiness filled her. She began to cry. Then all of a sudden she remembered Freddie Pelham and her mother waiting in Vienna. She said, "Freddie, someone must stop him." She sprang up. "Charles, it isn't too late. It isn't too late. Archie." She turned to him with outstretched hands, and Archie Miller turned away. Charles Moray put his arm about her. "Better tell her," he said in a low voice. He spoke to Miss Silver. Then Margaret. Miss Silver spoke in her colourless tones. "Miss Langton, your mother is quite safe. Mr. Pelham has been arrested." Margaret leaned against Charles. She felt weak and cold. Miss Silver took her hand and patted it. Her touch was kind. "I bought a paper on my way here. Mr. Pelham was arrested in his flight. His aeroplane crashed in the fog. The pilot was picked up by a channel boat. Mr. Pelham was drowned. Your mother, my dear, is quite safe." Margaret tried to say thank you. She knew Miss Silver was kind. She knew there had been a deliverance, but she had come to the end of her strength. She turned and hid her face on Charles Moray's dusty coat. Part of a letter from Miss Margot Standing to her friend Stephanie. "I'll tell you all about it at Christmas. We'll have a lovely time, and you shall see Archie. We're not engaged because Papa says I'm not old enough to be engaged, and Archie says so too. Archie's frightfully in love with me. At least he won't say he is, but I'm sure he is, and Papa likes him most frightfully. I think I shall have a sapphire ring, but I don't want to be married for simply ages. Margaret and Charles are going to be married next week. I would love to be Margaret's bridesmaid, but she isn't going to have any because of her stepfather. He was a nice little man, and I expect she's frightfully sorry about it. He was drowned in an aeroplane, so she and Charles aren't really going to have a wedding. They're just going to be married. I call it frightfully dull." End of section 45. End of Grey Mask by Patricia Wentworth.